James, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, so
you just completely changed and lost.
I had that same thing happen because I'm on the iPad and on the computer. So I'm Sebastian Inlet District and me. Let me see if can you see my video?
Now I can. It was weird. I couldn't see any of them for a second.
Yeah, it's a black screen for me too, and I was curious what's going on. Hey, Angela.
Hey, it's a black screen because it's the video queued up, and there's no like title slide. So as soon as it's 11:30, I will just hit play, and then it'll start. So I can shrink it if it's the black screen is.
Nope, it's fine. It's all good. Okay. Just trying to make sure we're back in the session.
Yes, you're
just right. For Angela, to let you know, I'm on my iPad under James Gray, and then the computer, Sebastian Inlet District doesn't need to be the host, but if you want to keep a co-host, doesn't matter. But really, me is where I'll need to be a co-host because I'll be running it through the iPad.
Okay, I'll make you co-host right now, James.
Thank you.
Yes, here we go.
All right.
You now have the power.
I have the power. All right. We'll see you guys in a little bit.
Okay, I'm going to mute. All right, guys, the session will be starting in about 10 seconds. I'm just going to give you a heads up.
I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Krista Court. She is with the University of Florida, where she's been for the past 4 years. And this morning, she's connecting from Tennessee. Welcome, Krista. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. My name is Krista Court. I'm an assistant professor of regional economics and director of the Economic Impact Analysis program in the Food and Resource Economics Department at the University of Florida here in Gainesville, Florida. So I've been asked to speak very briefly about measuring the economic contributions and impacts associated with artificial reefs. But before I get started, I'd like to thank the Planning Committee for the opportunity to present, as well as congratulate them in their adaptability to move to this virtual format throughout a pandemic. I'd also like to thank two colleagues, Ed Camp and Andrew Ropicki, as they've made significant contributions to some of the material that I'll present today. So how might an artificial reef affect a local economy? So there could be two ways: short-term effects associated with construction, where the artificial reef installation is directly resulting in economic effects, or ongoing activity and effects associated with the existence of a successful artificial reef project. So here we're seeing indirect effects, indirect economic effects from the artificial reef through ecological effects, such as changes in fish populations, resulting in expenditures on economic activity, such as recreational fishing. So this idea that artificial reefs result in economic effects is not a new concept. It's actually been studied since at least the 1970s, and that 4 decades of research has resulted in a plethora of methods, metrics, and measures. Often even us economists use terminology interchangeably and get some of the information mixed up where we're not comparing apples to apples. So you might have seen quotations in the academic literature or policy reports, sayings like total annual expenditures by reef users were estimated to be, or associated expenditures supported X jobs and Y $1 million in wages and salaries, or even something like the annual willingness to pay for a new artificial reef was. Understanding a lot of these different economic metrics is not easy. So first, before we dive into trying to understand them, why do economic metrics matter? So they actually allow us to compare different options with regard to planning, policy, and management, and they enable informed decision-making. So the use of the right metrics is vital, though. So sometimes a wrong number or a miscommunicated or misinterpreted number can actually be worse than no number at all. When we're moving these economic metrics forward into something like a coupled natural human system model or a socioecological model, we want to make sure that we're not just taking a number for the sake of taking a number and building it in. We fall victim to the old adage of garbage in, garbage out. So we want to make sure that the economic information going into these models is not only validated, but is also used properly. So Ed Camp and I actually came up with this conceptual diagram when we started to think about all of the types of metrics that were out there and how they related to one another. And I'll spend most of my time talking about this horizontal or blue axis that we've labeled an activity axis. Both axes here originate at expenditures or sales revenue. That's that direct economic effect. When we're looking at this horizontal blue axis, we're looking at additional market activity that's supported as a result of an expenditure. So here, a lot of you have probably heard of the term multiplier effect. This is where you'll see economic contributions or economic impacts coming into play. On this vertical or orange axis, I won't spend much time talking about this today, but there's also this idea that there's additional value or additional benefits in terms of things like consumer surplus, ecosystem service values, or non-use values that are just as important, and we are able to put economic values on them, but they're not associated with market activity, and they would not be something that would move forward into a multiplier analysis. So if we think in the context of an artificial reef, these expenditures would be things like the purchase and placement of material for deployment of the reef, the purchase of supplies and gears by recreational fishers or divers, or even the hire of charter fishing or diving vessels. So I want to focus a little bit more, make sure we understand this idea of a multiplier. So I mentioned that this was the additional activity supported by, or in addition to the direct expenditures, but what is actually included there when you see this within a report? So there's two things. There's indirect effects, a measure of inter-industry transactions that take place throughout multiple rounds of supply chain spending. So if you think of the example of deploying an artificial reef made out of concrete, you had to purchase the concrete from a concrete manufacturer who had to purchase materials in order to make the concrete, and all of the industries he was purchasing it from, or she was purchasing from, had to purchase their own input goods and services, and so on and so forth throughout multiple rounds of supply chain spending. There could potentially also be induced effects. So these are a measure of the spending of employee wages that stem from wages paid as a result of both direct and indirect impacts. So if you think of the employees directly involved in deploying the artificial reef, or the concrete manufacturer, or any of those other businesses involved, they're spending their money in the local economy, or at least a portion of their money, on things like healthcare, food, entertainment, housing. And if we think about it another way, a portion of expenditures or sales revenues collected are respent in the local economy. So think about $1 of sales revenue for a local business, say a for-hire fishing charter comes in. A portion of that dollar is spent on input goods, services, and employee wages that originate in the local economy. So the rest of that dollar is spent on things that were imported or outside of the local economy and essentially leaks out. A portion of what remains is then respent on inputs, goods, services, employee wages, again, that originate in the local economy. And this process goes on and on. These rounds of spending continue until the portions remaining in the local economy are negligible. So if we add up all of that local respending, and this gives us an output multiplier. So as an example here, the output multiplier for the Florida commercial fishing industry is 1.18. So this means that for every $1 of industry output produced in commercial fishing, there's actually $1.18 of economic activity supported throughout Florida's entire economy. So that 18 cents is activity in industries outside of commercial fishing. So this gives us two metrics for measuring this type of market activity associated with artificial reefs. So one is economic contributions. So this is an economic value of total economic activity within an existing regional economy that can be attributed to the artificial reef. There's also the idea of economic impacts, where here we would be very specifically adjusting our methods and adjusting the activities included to capture net changes in economic activity resulting from the deployment of the artificial reef. So this is a change due to the artificial reef versus just trying to put a value on or a value on the importance of the artificial reef to the local economy. Now, even economists are guilty of using these terms interchangeably, but it is important to remember that the methods are different and the metrics are different. So we talked a lot about how the economy could be feel effects of changes to the ecological system resulting from the artificial reef. But I do want to point out that changes in the economic system, whether or not they're driven by the existence or the placement of the artificial reef, could actually result in ecological effects themselves, which, we get into this feedback loop of the ecological system and the economic system affecting one another. So what can we do to improve knowledge in this area? I'd say make research findings accessible. That's accessible to academics and other disciplines, as well as to the many different stakeholders that are involved. So accessible means not only do they have these numbers, but they know how to use them. Also gather feedback on the usefulness or the relevancy of this knowledge. So, we could encourage problem-driven research with community support. Is the information that we are providing or valuing important to the decisions that they're making? And if it's not, we should adjust this process a little bit to make sure that it is. And finally, incorporating results into socioecological models and resource management decisions. You'll hear a lot more about this in this session, but I just encourage work with an interdisciplinary team to properly account for those bidirectional relationships between the human and natural systems that can be impacted by these artificial reefs. So thank you very much. That's all I have, and I look forward to the Q&A session.
I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Ed Camp, assistant professor at the University of Florida for the past 3 years. Ed is connecting to us this morning from his home in Gainesville, Florida. Welcome, Ed. Take it away.
Thank you for listening to me. I also want to thank the University of Florida for funding and supporting my work, and I want to thank Angela and Keith and the entire Artificial Reef Symposium Planning Committee for the tremendous amount of work that they've done to pull this off almost multiple times. Now, the matter at hand, which is artificial reefs and how they may but are not guaranteed to affect recreational fisheries. And I must apologize, this title did not age well. It turns out there's all manner of things that we don't know that can hurt us. It was really quite a silly title. What I want to talk about today is really the logic and perhaps some of the math behind the ways that artificial reefs theoretically can work. So, artificial reefs seem popular. Why is this? I think this is fairly straightforward. We think they have the potential to improve fish populations, largely by increasing recruitment, though possibly through decreasing mortality. They can improve fishing, perhaps by increasing catch rates as a function of increased catchability. And they can bolster local economies. More people fishing means more dollars spent, which ultimately translates to jobs. So this is straightforward, we know this, but the question is, can they do all of these things at once for the same species or fishery in the same place? And if so, for how long? Basically, this is asking, are the alleged effects of artificial reefs logically consistent together, and are they sustainable? And I think the key to answering this question is to look at artificial reefs within the context of a recreational fisheries system being the key idea here. So in the literature, sometimes these get called socioecological systems or coupled human-natural systems. But the point is, in recreational fisheries, we think the fish and the fishers are connected by a series of feedbacks. That is, what one does affects the other and vice versa. So we can't figure out what's going on with the system unless we're accounting for both of them. So for example, fishers affect fish largely by killing them through their behavior, how much they fish and how good they are at fishing, how effective every unit of effort is. Whereas the fish populations, as those go up and down, that's going to affect these same fisher behaviors in terms of how much they fish and perhaps their catchability. So the point of this is that artificial reefs, understanding what they're doing to the fisheries system requires understanding their direct and their indirect effects. And so how might we do that? I've explored it with a really simple simulation model. And you can consider a simulation model as basically just writing down your logical assumptions and sticking them together with some code and some math to figure out if they make sense. And in this really simple model, I've assumed just two direct ways that artificial reefs can affect the system. And by direct, I mean without considering these feedbacks. So one is they increase fish productivity. either by recruitment or natural mortality. And the other is they increase angler satisfaction. And I'm talking about inherent satisfaction here. So this is just people being happier in general that reefs exist in their system. Okay, so if those are the direct effects, the indirect effects would be the things that are mediated by these behavioral feedbacks. So basically, hey, let's assume fish production went up. There's more fish out there. Well, there might be a fishing response to that. Say fish go up by 10%, fishing effort might go up by 10%. Or let's assume that the fish actually really like the artificial reefs, so they aggregate to them. That might translate as an increase in catchability. Or maybe the reason people are more happy about artificial reefs is that they actually know that their catchability will go up around them. So these are the indirect effects, these feedbacks. And then the response metrics are just taken from why we think reefs might be popular. So looking at fish population, fishing quality, angler satisfaction, and the local economy. So let's apply logic. And again, this is going to be the form of a really simple simulation model. It was tuned for gag grouper in Florida's Gulf Coast. It could be adapted for other things. And I'm just going to show you some real quick summary results of what I've done. And I'm doing that just with simple tables here where the response metrics are in the columns, fish, the catch rate, the satisfaction, either on a per trip basis or the overall satisfaction, site-specific effort, and then regional effort, which would relate to the local economy and jobs. And then the rows here are basically, well, what are we assuming about the indirect effects? None, there is an effort response, there's an effort response and a catchability response. Okay, so first direct effect is artificial reefs increase fish productivity. Okay, so if we're assuming no effort response and no catchability response, the fish population must increase, the catch rates will go up, and the satisfaction per trip will go up, but the overall satisfaction, will go up, but the overall effort isn't going to, right? Because not responsive effort. So we get the biological benefits and some social, but not the economic. Now, if we assume that there's, say, a proportional effort response, so 20% increase in fish, 20% increase in effort, we actually might not see a big increase in the fish population at all because it's just going to be balanced out by the fishing. So catch rates and fish should be the same. Satisfaction on a per trip basis would be similar, but there'd be more people satisfied. And that would be because there are more trips, translating to more economic contribution. Okay, so we're not sure if we're going to get the biological ones, but we get the economic benefits here. Now, things are confusing if we assume there's a catchability response too, and that becomes, is because we basically have turned this into like a seesaw, a balance equation. Is the increase in fish productivity enough to outweigh the increase in catchability and the effort response? Fishing mortality is effort times catchability, F times Q, or effort times Q. And so basically, whether we're going to have an increase or decrease in the fish, the catch rates, the satisfaction, and even the economy depends on how much these things go up relative to each other. But the point of this is that we actually get some trade-offs where if we want to assume for sure that we're going to have increases in the fish population and catch rate, we've got to assume the opposite of what we would assume if we want to be sure we're going to have the effort response, right? Or if we're going to assume that we're going to have the economic effects. If we know we're going to have the economic effects, that means implicitly assuming there is an effort response. And if we assume that, we can't assume for sure that we're going to have an increased fish population. And if you assume the catchability too, well, then there's a whole range of outcomes that could happen. Okay, so the other simple direct effect which we considered here was an increase in inherent satisfaction. So fish population doesn't change, there's no more effort, but people are just happier, okay? So we're not getting biology, we're not getting really economic, but we are getting social. Now, if we throw the effort response in there, but assume that the artificial reefs didn't actually increase fish productivity, fish populations are going to go down, fishing effort will go up, so good for the economy, and we're not sure how satisfaction is going to shake out because it depends, are people more happy that there's reefs than they are less happy that the catch rates might fall? And then again, when we have the catchability in here, more things become confusing because, okay, the fish population will decrease, but is it enough to outweigh satisfaction? And does effort go down because actually there's fewer people there's fewer fish there now, so maybe effort decreases. Again, the point here is that there's some trade-off where we're going to be relatively sure under this direct effect assumption that we get some of what we want, but it's going to come at the cost of, in this case, the fish production. So the main point in this is that being super sure of the biological or the economic effects of artificial reefs, it requires making these opposite assumptions about the way the system works. And those assumptions can't both be true at the same time. So it's not really consistent to be able to assume, based off first principles, that reefs are going to do all of these things at once. It's actually going to be really tricky for them to be able to have all these benefits at once. It requires the specific assumption that fish production is outweighed in magnitude by the product of increased effort and catchability. That is, artificial reefs must increase the fish production by more than they are increasing the product of fishing effort and catchability. So if we're having recruitment increase by, say, 20%, but catchability is going up by twofold and even effort staying constant, that's not going to work in the long term. Now, a lot of things are missing from what I described here, which obviously was a simple simulation, but it was also a really simple explanation. I looked at this for a single case study, which was gag grouper, but we need more realism here for really specific systems because the biological effects are likely to vary not only fish by fish, but even reef type by reef type and where they're placed in terms of, well, will they affect recruitment or natural mortality or both? And then a massive thing that this wasn't considering was what is the effect of management? So it's one thing if the harvest rate goes up a little bit for a species that isn't heavily exploited, but if it goes up for something that's right on the edge and it triggers more restrictive management actions like shorter seasons, that's going to have a really pronounced effect on the social satisfaction of anglers with fewer days to harvest, as well as the economic effects for the local economy. And so what I'm hoping is if we can build up these case-specific studies, wrap them with these management strategy evaluations, we'll eventually be able to move toward these strategic cooperative plans where we're working hand in hand with stakeholders to evaluate the best way to put artificial reefs in. And with that, I will thank you for your time.
I'm pleased to introduce Lisa Chong. She is a PhD student at the University of Florida, and she's connecting to us from her home in Gainesville, Florida. Welcome, Lisa. Take it away.
Thank you, Keith. So today I'll be talking about a dissertation project I'm working on, and I'm working on it with Ed Camp. So the title of the talk is Spatial Considerations Can Determine Net Social Ecological Effects of Artificial Reefs on Recreational Fisheries and Their Management. So artificial reefs are deployed to improve fishing opportunities, enhance fish populations, and provide economic benefits to local communities. So artificial reefs may have impact on fish populations in terms of recruitment, natural mortality and survival, growth, and fish movement in function of habitat quality. Artificial reefs are likely to influence angler behavior in terms of site choice, the amount of trips taken, catchability in terms of the rate of effective search, catch per unit of effort, and ultimately satisfaction with their fishing experience. Together, fish and anglers will affect the fishery. Artificial reefs are expected to have some effect on overall effort, market activity, and the spatial distribution of dollars, harvest rates or fishing-related mortalities, and regulations needed to control the harvest rate. So it's important to note here that changes in angler behavior in terms of catchability and effort will result in changes in harvest rate. And this will make managers legally obligated to make some management actions like shorter season lengths, and that may make anglers dissatisfied. So we have some understanding of how artificial reefs impact fish and anglers, but are they really considered in fisheries management? So artificial reefs are considered as fisheries management tool in the National Artificial Reef Plan, but they are rarely explicitly mentioned in fisheries management and their decision. So this leads us to the question of what is preventing us from making decisions about artificial reefs in a fisheries management context. There is a notable lack of quantitative evaluations of effects of artificial reefs on social ecological systems, which includes the interactions between fish, anglers, and the management. So there is a strong need for thorough research to provide evidence that supports decision making, which we can use to evaluate the effectiveness of our fisheries and fisheries, and then we can set quantitative goals and objectives. So the objective of this talk is to analyze the net effects of the implementation and placement of our fisheries on fishery systems and their management. So we approach this objective by creating an empirically parameterized, spatially explicit simulation model, where we simulated artificial reef placements, the fish population dynamics, and the angler behavior. So for now, we're only focusing on the outcomes of the model and ignoring the management process. So we modeled a portion of the panhandle with 244 sites. So there are natural reefs in the model. I put this in quotes because we actually modeled the hard bottom substrate, but I'll keep calling them natural reefs in this presentation. We modeled artificial reefs, which are not pictured here, but we explored the placement of them. And then we have the human population centers where the fishers come from. And then we also modeled the depths from 10 to 200 meters. In the model, fish and anglers can move depending on their preference. Each cell has a portion of the population of the fish, and then the anglers can allocate their effort to each site depending on preferences like distance from the landing sites or the human population centers. So the species of interest that the model was based on is the Gulf of Mexico red snapper, because they're known to use artificial reefs for habitat. We used input values of growth, natural mortality, recruitment, selectivity, and selectivity based on literature and the most recent stock assessment, CDAR 52. So for the analysis, we created a null model. This null model has no artificial reefs, and there are natural reefs in that model. So we created scenarios based on our assumptions of the effects of artificial reefs on fish and anglers, and then we also make scenarios based on the placement of artificial reefs. We ran the model for 100 years for equilibrium, and then we compared only the last year in terms of percent change. The metrics we looked at are spawning stock biomass, effort, and total utility. So we made assumptions about the effects of artificial reefs on fish and anglers. We assume that there are social benefits in terms of catchability and utility, and then there's biological benefits in terms of natural mortality and recruitment. So for catchability, we assume that anglers know the location of artificial reefs, and then they're able to go and improve their effectiveness in catching fish. And then there's an increased utility of just having the artificial reefs at that site. They're more satisfied that there is one. We assume that there's decreased natural mortality and an increased recruitment. So we toggle with these parameters, and then the first assumption here is that there are benefits, and it's called the all benefits scenario. So then we turned off the biological benefits and only increased catchability and utility. This is called the only social scenario assumption. Then we turned off the social benefits, and this is called the biological assumption. Then lastly, we turned off all of them, and this is the no benefits. So we assume that artificial reefs provide no additional social or biological benefits. So we looked at 2 placement scenarios, and each scenario had 15 artificial reefs. The 2 scenarios here are the distance from the landing sites or the human population centers, and it's just near versus far away from them. So to reiterate the scenarios, we have 2 placement scenarios, and then we have 4 assumptions, biological versus social. And in total, that'll be 8 scenarios. So here we have the results. So we have the results again in terms of the percent change from the null model, and this is for the entire region. On the top row, we have the scenario of artificial reefs near shore. Then the bottom row is the scenario with the artificial reefs far away from shore. And each column, we have the assumptions. So when the biological parameters are turned on, we have the most beneficial fishery outcomes. All the metrics increased. But it is a bit counterintuitive here. So when there are no additional social benefits of our fisheries and the only biological assumption, there's still an increase in effort and utility, nearly the same magnitude as the all benefits assumption. This would mean that our fisheries are increasing spawning stock biomass, effort, and utility to the region, even without having increased catchability or utility in having the our fisheries there. When we have the only social benefits, there are decreased spawning stock biomass and only little changes in effort and total utility. Here is also a bit less intuitive because you would think that there would be decreased spawning stock biomass, but also increased effort and utility, especially if we had increased social benefits of catchability and utility of our fisheries. So I'm not presenting the site-specific changes, but this is the case where effort and utility are only being increased at the sites with our fisheries. So when we assume that there are only social benefits of our fisheries, there are no increased metrics in the region context. So when our fisheries are placed further away from shore, there are slight changes in terms of the magnitude of percent changes. There's a higher increase in spawning stock biomass, especially in the only biological assumption, and slight higher decrease in spawning stock biomass when we assume our fisheries only bring social benefits. So there is a distance from shore, and it does make a difference. So there are additional placement scenarios we could explore, like distance from natural reefs, near versus far away from natural reefs, and this will look into the relationship between our fisheries and natural reefs. Then we could also look at more realistic assumptions. So in a paper by Karnowskis et al., they found that at our fishery sites, there could be up to 20 times higher catch rates. And then we only think that there's little biological benefits. There's a literature review currently going on we will be able to make more realistic assumptions of our fisheries in our models. So it's worth mentioning that we explore very optimistic assumptions of our fisheries since all the scenarios had dynamic effort response and then in other words, that meant that there's moderate effort responsiveness and the changes of total utility. So this model can be converted to a simulation model, and it could be used for decision making to include stakeholder input and engagement. So with that, I'd like to thank Ed, my advisor, and my lab. And if you have any questions, please let me know, and you could email me.
I'm pleased to introduce Lisa Chong. She's a PhD student at the University of Florida, and she's connecting to us from her home in Gainesville, Florida. Welcome, Lisa. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for those great talks. This is now entering into our question session. Please let us know if you have any questions. There were a few that came through for Ed. If you could type any additional questions you may have into the chat box, that would be great. The first question for Ed came from Kevin Thompson. In the modeling work, in this case, recruitment is assumed to be recruitment that would otherwise not happen in the population, correct?
Yeah, so this is handling recruitment defined as the cessation or the graduation of fish from the density-dependent mortality stage that we assume that they go through. That stage is super important. If you don't have density-dependent mortality, you don't have sustainability, full stop, whether you have fishing or not. So we kind of have to assume that there's density-dependent mortality going on. And so we want to assume in these scenarios that artificial reefs may increase the amount of habitat suitable for recruitment. So if we want to look at this for a specific species, what we'd be assuming is that some artificial reefs are actually constituting areas where certain species, whether that's gag or red snapper or vermilion snapper or whatever, can actually recruit. So we're seeing more recruitment than we would otherwise see on average. That's a short answer to the question, and I don't want to keep it short so that we get to others. If there's empty space, we can go back to it.
Excellent. Well, we did have another question come in from Jeff Renson for Ed. Also, in your models, can you weigh catchability, effort, impact by incorporating the number of fishes in an area that an artificial reef is deployed?
Yeah, so I tried to clarify this, and I think what Jeff said is he's looking at sort of overall effects on the fish population, which is a neat example of this is where we get into trouble with our economist friends like Krista a lot, is that we use the term, the noun impact all the time, and that's like a proper noun for an economist. And so, yeah, would the change in effort or catchability matter depending on where you were? Yes and no. So if you're looking, changes in effort or changes in catchability are going to affect the fish stock through the fishing mortality rate. The fishing mortality rate is simply effort times catchability. So a 20% increase in effort would have a 20% increase in fishing mortality rate if Q was unchanged, whether you're in the Big Bend or whether you're in Southwest Florida. Now, what effect that would have on the overall population would depend on how close that population is to overfishing. And in the case of many of these stocks, they're assessed at not even a statewide scale, but a half of the Gulf scale. So really, I think what you're getting at is, would we be seeing big effects in terms of local depletion? Yeah, that's going to matter on how the local populations or the local abundances, how heavily they're fished. The other thing that you may have been getting at there, Jeff, and feel free to jump in here and correct me, is, is it less or more reasonable that you could have a 20% increase in effort at a less populated area than a more populated area? That's a different question, and that has to do with how much latent effort we think is in the human population around a fishing area. We absolutely can account for that. So we can weight by human populations and basically scale what the maximum effort would be. The simple way that I've done effort dynamics in these models is to assume that effort is a function of how quickly people respond to increasing basically satisfaction from fishing and what the max effort is. So we can assume that the max effort is different in different parts of the state and allow it to have the potential to increase more or less. But when we do that, we do have to be really careful of how far people are traveling to go to fish. We've done some analysis on this, and it shows that for certain reef species, especially red snapper, people are traveling on average really, really long distances. So a lot of the effort on the panhandle is coming from out of state or from really far within state. So it's not simply, it probably shouldn't be as simple as just what's the county level human population density to scale what the effort response is, because we have to consider the statistical expectations of travel distance too. The good news is we do have the data to inform that from the National Marine Fisheries Service MRIP program. So there's a question for Krista here about feedback loops. Leslie Haynes said, feedback loop is interesting. So what does the reverse of this look like? Would you say decreased economic activity would be equal to increased ecological outcomes?
So I let Leslie know in the chat that my true economist answer is it depends, right? I think the first thing I would point out is that a lot of the models that we use to estimate these economic contributions or economic impacts or even the multipliers are based on a static economic structure. So one of the things that we want to do when we're considering these potentially long-term effects on, how an artificial reef has, creates these ecological effects that you're talking about with fish populations, which in turn can contribute to economic activity or increased recreational fishing. That takes time. And in that feedback loop, we would want to consider not only some kind of direct environmental impact of that new economic activity, whether it was increased recreational fishing or any of those other multiplier activities that we talked about through supply chain. But those things themselves, the environmental outputs associated with economic activities are also changing over time. So if we're talking about things that are taking a 5, 10, 15, 20-year time frame to really play out, that economic structure will be different, and the ecological effects that we're expecting might also be different or impacted by outside forces. Sorry about the dog.
Very good. So there's a question for Lisa, which was basically, do you have plans to expand this model to the peninsula where there's more effort, but anglers have to travel farther offshore for red snapper?
So I answered it in the chat, but basically, yeah. So we did a small model just to show the potential of the model, but we do plan on expanding it to the West Coast. And then I didn't have time in my talk to say that I'll also include. Oh, and then also we might also have a separate model for the South Atlantic stock as well.
Yeah, so to follow up on a quick note here that was mentioned in the earlier session this morning, the question was asked, how close are we to having models that can operate at different spatial scales, regional or state scale for this, for artificial reefs? And I think we're pretty close. So a couple of the folks I work with, Lisa here, and then one of the other folks in my lab, Nick Fish, are developing basically management strategy evaluation models for red snapper in this case that will be either at regional, like Panhandle, or statewide scales for Florida. And with these frameworks, we can play games like asking, with all of these feedbacks taken into account, those sort of second and third order effects incorporated into the model, at least as best as we can, what are going to be the effects of artificial reefs down the road? And so the scale is there. We're building the tools to do it. What our greatest weaknesses right now is the empirical support for what those second and third order effects will be. We have a decent idea based off literature and what's happened before. Where we're really short on this is monitoring the socioeconomic effects. So how does angling effort change when we put all these artificial reefs in? We're getting now some feedback on what catchability does, but we'll have to see how the fishing effort responds to the change in catchability and all that stuff. So that's kind of where that is right now.
I was muted. I actually had a question from the socio side of things. Have there been any studies in art form reefs or reefs of different structures? Obviously, art form reefs have a lot of benefit, recreational fishing perhaps, or locating these reefs in an area such that would attract more fishers or recreational users. Have that been inputted in any of your models or studies looking at from not just a location standpoint, but from just a use standpoint, and how that may increase recreational use, perhaps?
Good question. And this relates to one of the questions that we haven't answered yet in the chat. I'm sorry, I can't remember right now who it's from. Looks like Katie Brown, I think. So the short answer to that is the modeling that I have done and that I'm going to talk for Lisa for a minute, that Lisa is working on now, is focused on artificial reefs for recreational fisheries. Those tools can be put to other purposes. So you can pretty easily turn fishers into divers where, especially not spearfishing divers, where they're not having an effect on the fish population, and when you're using the models to say, well, how is this going to affect satisfaction or utility? How's it going to affect effort? How's that going to run up into changes in economic value or economic impact? So it can be done. It's simply turning off that feedback loop whereby the humans affect the fish population directly by killing them. The other thing to note is that there are studies in Southeast Florida that I think Keith Milley knows more about, where people have specifically, a team of economists have specifically been looking to try to quantify the value and impact / contributions of reefs there. And the focus for that study is very much on diving and viewing rather than harvesting. And we are getting close to the time limit here, but we're also the last session of the day. So if Angela's okay with it, I'm gonna post the links for tonight. There is the little happy hour session that we would have. I'm going to remind people to check out the following Zoom sessions, and I am going to recommend that we consider this fun game that people have suggested, where we try to guess the lengths of fish in various photos for our happy hour session. My guess would be this fish is smaller than the motor. Big motor. So that is going on tonight, I think at 5:30, is that correct? That's correct.
Yes.
Okay. Angela and Keith, is it okay if some of the speakers, if they would like to stay on to address any other questions that people had? There were a couple others that we didn't get to, but no one should feel compelled to stay.
Yes, absolutely. I think, you know, everybody, out of respect for your lunch hours, feel free to drop off and know that this session was completely recorded, and you can tune back in to all of the sessions that happened today and yesterday in the virtual event platform. Those will live there for almost a year, so you have time to rewatch videos if you like. And the Zoom link for the happy hour will be posted in the virtual platform as well. So check that out later on this evening if you feel like hanging out with some more of your people on Zoom here.
So, sorry, do you want to go ahead, James?
Oh, I just wanted to say before everybody drops off, you know, there's still going to be some people remaining, but I just wanted to, again, thank all the speakers and also our sponsors for this summit. Obviously, without you, the summit would not have been as seamless. So, or at least concluding to Thursday's session. So before everyone drops off, I just wanted to state that to everyone as well.
Ed, can I add to that question that Katie had there about the diving? So on the economic modeling side, there's really no reason that we can't include both. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to what money are they spending while they're participating in that activity. And at least to my knowledge, we don't have a good publicly available data set on a baseline, how much diving is out there and how that changes over time, like we do for the recreational fishing. So I would suspect that a lot of us spend more time modeling recreational fishing changes because we have some good data sources to do so. And if we were to start collecting some of that same information for diving, it would be much easier to incorporate that into the analyses as well.
Krista, while you're here, one of the questions that Alan Richardson had asked is whether the old multiplier that I think a number of the folks that you have probably, Adams and Huth, were using was $130 for a multiplier for the artificial reef construction. And the question is whether this is still applicable. I will let you field this.
$130? I don't think I know what, it doesn't sound like a multiplier. I would expect if it was an actual multiplier, it would be like 1.3. Like if I spent $100 on an artificial reef, then I'm expecting $130 of.
Yeah, so Alan, are you still on? Can you clarify? Alan may not be on, but it would be useful to just point out that, you know, basically what the multipliers are and the fact that you and Andrew and I are looking to update these numbers.
Yeah, he's typing and maybe he unmuted. I'll talk generally then about it. So A multiplier it's not a return on investment. So an old multiplier, very similar to ecosystem service valuation. A multiplier is specific to a time, it's specific to a place, and it can be used to talk about activity in a different time or different place, but only if that time and place is very similar to the original time and location. So if the analysis was done 10 years ago in South Florida, would I use it now for an artificial reef in the Panhandle? Probably not. But I know that Angela and Andrew Rapicki and probably Ed, you and I have talked about updating that old EDIS document so that we do have a more recent analysis of that. So we can certainly look to update that. Would I say that multiplier is better than nothing? Maybe, but only in so much as the artificial reef that you would like to use it for is similar to the artificial reef that you're looking at, or that they originally looked at, or the economic structure during the time period and in the geography that they were using is similar to what you're looking at now.
Okay, and so Alan is here, and I'm sorry for inferring that you might not be Alan. You clarified that what you're talking about here is basically return on investment or benefit to coastal communities. And so in that case, what we're referring to is probably economic value. I don't know where the $130 number came from specifically, and that's my fault for not being aware of everything that's been done, but it's also sort of my reality. I would not be able to say, yes, please go and use that, because if I'm remembering correctly, there was some conflation of the economic impacts and the dollars spent associated with artificial reefs and the actual net economic value. The net economic value is trying to value how much the improved fishing scaled by the number of basically increased trips would change from putting an artificial reef in. I'm not aware of any studies that have tried to look at the marginal or the net economic value of artificial reefs in Florida. The ones that have looked and tried to produce economic figures were basically saying, well, based off how many trips went to these reefs, this is what we think the value would be, but it was really closer to the expenditures, which would be the minimum value. And that's not accounting for the fact that we don't know whether those trips were redistributed from other areas or whether they were in fact new trips that were going out. And this is one of the challenges with trying to actually create real returns in investment. And it's logical if we think about it. We put this new thing in, and one of the things that people talk about right away is, well, fish show up on it right away. That's a redistribution of fish. And then one of the other things we talk about is anglers show up on it right away. And we don't know if that's a redistribution of anglers or if it's actually people who would have done something else and are now doing this. And we have to calculate not only, which are redistributing versus which are new, but what's their marginal gain in value over doing this as opposed to their next best option. So doing that is actually much harder. It requires a different series of economic tools designed to actually assess value as opposed to impact or contribution. Krista, did I get anything wrong on that?
Oh, that was pretty good.
I screw around with economics some, but sometimes I make mistakes. So I hang out with Krista and Andrew Rapicki to keep me on solid ground. It is something that we're looking to do. So one of the projects that Lisa and I are trying to get funded, and Krista and Andrew are of course involved with it as well, is to develop, they're called stated preference surveys, but they're surveys to actually empirically assess how artificial reefs are likely to change the economic value of fishing. There's a question that, again, nobody has to stay, everybody can go if they want, but Leslie had asked a question about, I'm hearing that angler satisfaction is decreased with decreased number of allowing fishing days, but that just means that anglers are more efficient or successful. So what do you think about the reverse, that angler satisfaction would increase although efficiency is decreased, that they just want the opportunity to harvest? This is super tricky. and we're trying to sort this out. We have a project that I completed with Elizabeth Pinar, who's now at University of Georgia. And we're working on the analysis of it now, is trying to get at exactly this. Would anglers rather have lower catch rates but a longer season, or would they rather have greater catch rates but a shorter season? Trying to get at those trade-offs between things. It is not an easy question to answer. And the short answer is that it probably varies with specific fisheries. And it's actually really complicated because different fisheries will have different discard mortality rates, and they're going to be exploited at different levels, which means that the harvest is going to change more or less rapidly depending on how things like catch rate change. So in general, when we build these models, we're assuming that satisfaction goes up when catch rate goes up. It goes up, but it does so at a saturating function, so diminishing marginal returns. We assume that satisfaction goes up when fish size goes up. And we assume that satisfaction goes up when days allowable to fish go up. We can also put in, and Lisa and I had this in our models, some inherent satisfaction if we say stakeholders really just like artificial reefs, and doing what stakeholders like is an okay thing to do. So yeah, it's a multi-attribute utility function that we use, which means it's accounting for different ways that people can get satisfaction, which you're getting at right here. And we're doing our best to use the values in the literature to make some reasonable assumptions. The reality is we don't know for specific fisheries how anglers are willing to trade off things like, you know, would I be okay with a 20% decreased catch rate for a 20% longer season of harvest? We're not sure about those things yet, but we would like to be.
I don't know if this is the right panel for this question, but I just out of my own curiosity, obviously Sebastian Inlet worked for Sebastian Inlet District. We're Tidal Inlet. There's a lot of fishing that goes off of the North Jetty, very popular spot. When I was at the county, Indian River County, previously working there, we deployed a number of reefs, and the county is still continuing deploying reefs just south of the inlet, probably about 5 miles south. Should there be any concern of any fishermen concerns if there's artificial reefs? 60 artificial reefs is what it's designed to do in this permitted section, at least be constructed. Should there be any concerns with fishermen on a North Jetty that are fishing the offshore reefs, or vice versa, if there's going to be any competition for perhaps that fishing? I don't know how to ask the question properly, but I'm just concerned if there's going to be any conflict potentially with different fishing user groups off jetty, for example, or fishermen offshore, perhaps affecting, you know, again, the socioeconomic or the concerns that might be from that matter.
Yeah, let me answer this quickly and then say that we'll observe a hard stop in 3 minutes at 12:30. Yep. But also you have all of our email and contact information. So anybody whose questions we didn't get to, Bill Lindbergh asked a very large question, and so did Keith Milley, and I saw them, but we should get to them later. So the short answer is that the artificial reefs may potentially increase conflict among user groups, and it isn't something that I've built into the models that I've done right now. It's something that I don't think has been assessed very well. But it is potentially a big issue when you get into areas where there is an avid dive for sightseeing community and an avid fishing for harvest community. I think that's the most likely conflict that we're going to see, more likely than the different types of fishing. You know, if they're within casting distance of the jetty, then you know, maybe it's an issue. But if it's not that, I don't think it will be, but the overall message would be, we do want to be thinking very carefully about what is the purpose of the artificial reef. And a couple of the regional reports, the people who gave those did a really nice job of pointing out, hey, this is designed for divers, or this is designed to actually alleviate congestion or tension between groups on different reefs. So yeah, we have to think, what is the objective of the reef, and what species are likely to be attracted and or recruiting on it, and then what anglers are going to be using. All of those things should be thought about. That pretty much puts us at time. There's a question that Shelby asked that I will probably respond to with email, Shelby, if that's okay. And yeah, I think that's about it. Really quickly, Shelby, I'm not sure of studies that have looked at those mixed uses yet or done so in an economic fashion. The study that I mentioned earlier that Keith knows about in Southeast Florida is probably the closest to it. I think this is something that will pop up more and more in the future. Okay, Shelby, I'll email you and we can work on that later. Thank you guys, thank you everyone, especially speakers, and everyone for listening to us. And we'll see you tonight to guess how big the fish is.
Good job, Ed. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting for all. So if you guys are trying to talk to each other, just know I'm gonna end it.
No, that's
okay.
good.
I just want to give you a warning before I click close. Okay. Great day,
See you later.
everybody.
Yeah.
See you
Thanks, guys.
tomorrow.